The Google Pixel 7 Pro and the Nothing Phone 2 look pretty different from the back, but if you want a high-end phone with a big screen, clean software, and your budget is around $600 to $700, in a lot of countries, these two phones might be your best available options right now. I personally made the side grade myself from the Pixel 7 Pro to the Nothing Phone 2 a few months ago, and I have a lot of thoughts. Ultimately, I'm glad I made the switch, and I personally think the Nothing Phone 2 is overall the better buy right now in 2023. But don't take that as a definite recommendation. The Pixel 7 Pro has some definite wins in some areas that might still be the deciding factor for a lot of people. Like most phones these days, both phones are made of glass and aluminum. They also have almost identical dimensions, so you can't really say one is bigger than the other. But the key difference here is that the Pixel has curved edges with slightly curved glass panels on both the front and back, while the Nothing Phone 2 is essentially flat on all sides. The back does curve very slightly to make gripping the flat sides easier. I know some users just can't deal with curved glass like the Pixels, but I actually don't have a big preference on this, and in this case, I do think it makes the device feel more premium. Speaking of premium, the Pixel is known to have some really excellent haptics, and I will say the Nothing Phone 2 comes close here. The Pixel still does have the better haptics, and their vibrate patterns can be very different, but both feel very firm and high quality. In terms of actual comfort and one-handed usage, the Nothing Phone 2 definitely wins there. It's 10 grams lighter and it's easier to grip the flat sides. You can dual SIM on both of these devices, but the Pixel can only support one physical SIM and one eSIM at the same time, while the Nothing Phone 2 doesn't have any eSIM support and can only support two physical SIMs. At the end though, I do think the Nothing Phone 2 has a much more interesting design that just looks really cool for people seeing it for the first time. The glyphs are there, I'll talk more about them later, and yeah, they do very little for me in terms of actual functionality, but even without the lights on the back, I would still choose this transparent design over the Pixel's visor-like design, but that's really on you to decide what looks better for you. Considering that these phones have very similar materials and dimensions, they also have very similar displays. Both displays are 6.7 inches LTPO OLED displays with variable refresh rates up to 120Hz. The Pixel does have a 1440p display over the Nothing Phone 2's 1080p, but the Pixel software defaults to 1080p out of the box, and that's actually how I use it throughout this whole time because it's actually very hard to tell the difference on a phone display. Just like the resolution, there's very little difference in brightness. While there is a slightly warmer tone, I prefer the more vibrant colors on the Nothing Phone's display. The Pixel is tuned to be a little more natural, so it looks a little duller in comparison. Both phones also have optical in-display fingerprint sensors. I initially thought that the Nothing Phone 2 sensor was much more faster and accurate, but they're actually quite similar in speed and reliability. In other words, they're both good, but for people who've had ultrasonic sensors before, this is just alright. Some users had some complaints about the sensor placement on the Nothing Phone 2, but both these spots are perfectly fine to me and I have no big preference. Being optical sensors though, they both still blind me at night, which is a shame. Face Unlock is here too for both phones as an additional option, but of course it's not as secure. Since these displays are OLED, both are capable of always on displays or AOD, and they look great. But what I found through this feature is that the Nothing Phone 2 seems to be using a more affordable, lesser quality OLED panel compared to the Pixel. Within the first week of using this phone, I've experienced noticeable burn-in from the always on display. Since then, I've turned off AOD until Nothing hopefully addresses a fix for it in the future. Both phones have stereo speakers using the earpiece in the bottom firing grills. However, the Pixel speakers are much louder and I found the audio quality to be much clearer as well with less distortion. On the Nothing Phone, my media volume is around 70% to 80% most of the time, while on the Pixel 7 Pro, I can be at around 50 to 60%. Pixel also has better balance between the left and the right speakers. There's really not much of an argument here. Pixel definitely takes the cake in the audio department. In terms of cameras, these camera systems are essentially in different classes. The Pixel 7 Pro has a triple lens camera system with a main, telephoto, and an ultra wide lens, then a 10.8 megapixel camera on the front, and the Nothing Phone 2 has a 32 megapixel front facing camera and only has a dual camera system with a 50 megapixel main lens and a 50 megapixel ultra wide lens. Yep, there is no telephoto lens here, which means you're not getting optical 2x or 3x shots here. All the zoom shots on the Nothing Phone are digital crops. This means you can get a lot more creative and more detailed with angles and zooms on the Pixel while also getting better portrait shots due to better depth of field. On the other hand, for daytime 1x shots, they can deliver similar results and it's really a toss-up. Sometimes I prefer the post-processing on the Pixel and sometimes it's on the Nothing Phone 2. The Pixel's photos do have great detail and I love the shots you can get for environments and landscapes, but for capturing people and faces, they seem a little over-processed. The Nothing Phone 2 is better with faces and also gets pretty good detail, but sometimes it tries to do a little too much with the colors and the photo either looks just a little too green or yellow. While most daylight photos are pretty great on both of these phones, the Nothing Phone still still doesn't get it quite right with exposure and white balance. For shots like these with a strong light source in the background, the Nothing phone really struggles to balance the subject and the background. Most of the time, it tends to overexpose the background and make it look a bit messy just like this. And as expected, the Pixel just dominates when it comes to low light shots. Not only can you get way more detail on the Pixel, the Nothing phone has a really tough time even just capturing low light scenes, significantly slowing down the shutter speed and a very stable position to get a decent shot. But the end results are also just worlds apart, just due to Google's long-term experience with post-processing algorithms. There's less of a gap in 4K video recordings, but the Pixel and the Nothing phone do well in stabilization and exposure adjustments. But the one big downside to the Nothing Phone 2 is that the microphones are just very subpar. As you can see and hear, they sound very muddy compared to the Pixel 7 Pro, which you can hear right now. On top of that, the front-facing camera tops out at 1080p 60 fps, while the Pixel's front camera gets you up to 4K 60 fps. Overall, the Pixel 7 Pro's cameras are just more reliable for almost all non-daylight environments. If camera quality is the most important thing for your phone buying decision, the Pixel is the obvious choice here. On the surface, the Pixel UI and Nothing OS aren't too different. They're both quite close to what people consider stock Android, very little pre-installed third-party apps, relatively minimal and clean setting menus, simple, smooth app opening and swiping animations, creating what people call an iPhone-like experience. But the difference is that Nothing OS offers a lot of aesthetic customization that differentiates the experience. On Nothing OS, you can either have the Pixel look or something totally unique like this monochrome look. You also get custom folders with custom icons, shapes, and sizes, which I really like. You also get some custom widgets. Even though they're not all visually consistent, some are really good ideas like the quick settings widgets, which you can also put on the lock screen. Of course, you can customize your glyph lights and light up patterns, so they light up differently for certain calls and essential notifications. The glyphs look really cool and it's always a party trick, but it's not useful to me 99% of the time because my phone is facing up almost all the time. When I really want to focus at work, I do put it facing down, but when it's like that, it's actually distracting for me when the lights come on. That's just me, but maybe it'll be more useful to some of you watching this video. On the other hand, Pixel has some exclusive features too. Call screening, really cool photo taking features like motion photos and unblur, and selecting text from the recent apps menu. Of course, it also has a super cool Magic Eraser feature, but you can also get it on any Android phone as long as you have a Google One subscription. To me, these are more of the nice to have features, but the truly killer feature that not a lot of people mention is the Pixel's Live Translate feature, which lets you auto-translate messages without having to copy and paste the on-screen text to a translator. For traveling and chatting with overseas family or friends, this is extremely useful. Besides that feature, I lean towards the more personalization features on Nothing OS. Those custom folders make home screen organization a lot easier for me, and I love the monochrome look. In terms of support, the Pixel 7 Pro gets 3 years of OS upgrades and 5 years of security updates. The Nothing Phone 2 is promised 3 years of software updates and 4 years of security updates. Since the Nothing Phone 2 was released a year after the Pixel, if you buy now, you'll technically get 1 more year of OS upgrades on the Nothing Phone. You do get monthly security updates on the Pixel, while on the Nothing Phone, you get security updates every 2 months. Also keep in mind that since Android is made by Google, you'll always get OS upgrades the fastest on the Pixel compared to any other phone. For internals and performance, it's less of a debate between these phones. The Pixel 7 Pro comes with the Tensor G2 processor and 12 gigs of RAM. The Nothing Phone 2 comes with a Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 processor and either 8 or 12 gigs of RAM. The model I have on hand has 12 gigs of RAM, so there's no discrepancy in RAM here between these two phones. In benchmarks, the Nothing Phone 2 beats the Pixel by quite a bit. In actual use, the speed gap is much smaller and the experience is actually very similar because of the well-tuned animations on both these devices. But Nothing seems to have tuned the animations a bit quicker and tighter, so it does feel slightly quicker than the Pixel in day-to-day use. For people who love the speed and smoothness of the iPhone, I think the Nothing Phone 2 gives you the closest experience in terms of that from the Android side. The Nothing Phone 2 is also much better in terms of thermals. It really didn't used to be like this, but the Pixel 7 Pro has had frequent overheating issues ever since around June 2023. Not only does the phone get really hot, apps load slower, apps close in the background, and the general performance just seems to have been going downhill since the middle of the year. Nothing Phone 2 is still a new device, so we'll have to see how it ages, but the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 is much more efficient chipset, and I haven't had any heat or performance issues on this phone. For most people, it's not a huge difference in day-to-day usage between these two phones, but the frequent warming up and heat from the Pixel 7 Pro will definitely get noticeable and annoying for a lot of people. On top of all that, I also found the Wi-Fi and general cell connectivity to be much more stable on the Nothing Phone 2. If performance and thermals are important to you, definitely go for the Nothing Phone 2. The difference in chipsets also gets us to the next topic, which is the battery life. The Nothing Phone 2 has a 4700 mAh battery, while the Pixel 7 Pro has a 5000 mAh battery. With the same exact usage patterns that you saw from my real-world test video with the Nothing Phone 2, the Pixel 7 Pro averages around 4 to 5 hours of screen on time per day, while the Nothing Phone 2 gets me from 6 to 7 hours of screen on time per day, which is actually a huge difference for me. On a really light day, the Nothing Phone 2 can get me 1.5 days of use, maybe 2. The Pixel 7 Pro definitely can't do that for me, and I typically end up charging my phone a few hours before bedtime. As you can tell, the chipset on the Nothing Phone 2 gets us much more efficient results. For charging, the Pixel 7 Pro can charge up to 23 watts, while the Nothing Phone 2 can get up to 40 watts. But for long-term battery health, I always have these phones set at optimized charging modes, so the charging times aren't too different, charging from 20 to 100% in an hour and 30 minutes. While both of these phones are excellent deals for what they offer at this price tag, and if we're ignoring what the upcoming Pixel 8 Pro may offer, my personal pick here is the Nothing Phone 2. In hardware quality, design, and software, it's really a toss-up between these two phones, and while the Pixel definitely wins in the camera department as a much more reliable shooter in most situations, the Nothing Phone 2's camera is good enough for me right now, and I prefer the faster and efficient performance and battery life. But if you're not satisfied with what the Nothing Phone 2 offers in camera quality, I'd say wait a month or two to see what the Pixel 8 Pro offers. Alright, that's going to do it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you guys think is a better option down in the comments. Still got my full review in the works for the Nothing Phone 2, so make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Thanks again, and I'll see you guys on the next video.